What's up guys, welcome to my Retribution Paladin guide for Legion patch 7.1.5. Now in this guide I'm going to go over your spells and abilities, your talents, your artifact traits and paladin choices, your stat priority, and then your DPS rotation for both single target and AoE, as well as demonstrations of that, and then just some macros and add-ons that I use that you might find useful. So go ahead and jump into your spells and abilities. I do want to make mention of your Holy Power resource first. It's a pretty simple system. Some abilities generate Holy Power, some spend it. You can hold up to 5, and if you go over 5, then you just waste those. Those are wasted and they do not come back or store anywhere. The first ability that does generate Holy Power is Crusader Strike. It's got a short cooldown, 2-charge system, and just melee range attack like that, does some damage, gives you 1 Holy Power. And then the next is Blade of Justice. 12-yard range, so kind of short range, but not completely melee range, does damage and generates 2 Holy Power for you. Now to spend that Holy Power, we've got 2 abilities baseline. The first is Templar's Verdict, 3 Holy Power, pretty simple melee range, just does damage like so. And then the other one is called Divine Storm. Now this also costs 3 Holy Power, and when you first get it, when you first level in your Pally and so on, it just does damage around you. Once you get your artifact traits up and you get the golden trait that makes it go in front of you, you'll see it kind of throws it in front of you like so, but it still hits around you. So generally it's just an AoE around you, and eventually becomes kind of a launched AoE in front of you. Now, we also have Judgment in our offensive toolkit, and this is a longer range, so 30-yard range ability. Hits a target, bounces up to one other target, and applies a debuff. And this debuff, as you can see, makes them take more damage from your 2 spenders, your Divine Storm and your Templar's Verdict, or any other spells that you might pick up in your talents that also spend Holy Power. Now, as far as offensive cooldowns go, you basically have one major one, and it's called Avenging Wrath. 2-minute cooldowns is your main DPS cooldown, just makes you do more damage and healing during the duration of Avenging Wrath, and you'll generally see it called Crusade because this is a talent that I'll recommend later, but we'll get more into that in the talent section. But that does replace it, but it's still your major main DPS cooldown. Now you also do have a more minor cooldown called Wake of Ashes. This is your artifact ability, and so you get it when you get Ashbringer. It's a 30-second cooldown, does cone damage in front of you, so damage in a conal shape, and it slows and also does stun undead and demon enemies for 6 seconds, so it's really cool. When you get a golden trait, it will buff it so that when you use it, as you can see here, you gain 5 Holy Power instantly, and it also does an extra damage over time portion, which is pretty cool. Next up, we've got a couple buffs as a Retribution Paladin, and the first is Greater Blessing of Kings, and the other is Greater Blessing of Wisdom. Now, Kings basically just does a small absorb shield that refreshes every so often, and Wisdom gives the target health and mana back every 10 seconds. So generally you want to put Kings on like a tank or something, or someone who's taking constant damage, and Wisdom on a healer or someone who needs it like an Arcane Mage, but you can kind of figure that out for yourself and talk to your group about it. You can put 1 of each total, so just 1 Kings and 1 Wisdom. As far as defensive cooldowns go, we do have Shield of Vengeance, and it's a, I believe, 2-minute baseline cooldown, and the artifact traits will reduce it to the 1.5-minute cooldown you see here. Puts an absorb shield on you, and basically if that absorb shield breaks, then it blows up for damage. So as you can see, if I aggro this thing here, and it starts hitting me, the shield will eventually blow up and do damage to everything around me. So it's kind of offensive and defensive at the same time. So you can use it to up your damage a little bit, but you can also use it to save yourself from dying. Now, we also have Divine Shield, and Divine Shield is a 5-minute cooldown by default. I have a talent right now that's making it a bit shorter, but for 8 seconds you are immune to all damage. You remove all the debuffs you have, unless of course it's one of those that Blizzard has decided to make unremovable, stuff like that, but basically makes you immune for 8 seconds. It does also apply debuff, as you'll see, called Forbearance. So this is how the bubble looks, and Forbearance prevents you from receiving any spells that are listed here, so Divine Shield, Hand of Protection, Lay on Hands, basically anything that also causes Forbearance. So Lay on Hands, 10-minute cooldown, it's a full health heal, so your full health, which is 2.7 million for me, as you can see here, or so, and basically it causes Forbearance as well. So now that Forbearance is gone, I could use it, and as soon as I do use it, it will apply Forbearance, and I can't use any of those abilities again. And then the last one in that list is Blessing of Protection, 5-minute cooldown, baseline, artifact traits again, reducing this, and basically it's like Divine Shield but just for physical damage. so it removes all physical debuffs and prevents all physical damage to the target. You can still attack through it. It will also remove threat from tanks, so just be careful about calling or using it on them, so that you might cause like a threat drop and something wonky with the taunts and stuff. In addition, we do have Blessing of Freedom. You can cast this on people, 25-second cooldown. It removes all roots and snares and gives you this cool little buff, and it makes you immune to those effects for the duration and slows as well. So it's pretty cool. Can get you out of those kinds of CC. Very, very useful. We also have a slow 30-second cooldown, Hand of Hindrance. It just slows the enemy 70% for 10 seconds. We also do have a Dispel in Cleanse Toxins, 8-second cooldown. If you dispel something, it's got poison and diseases that it can remove. And then we do have our melee interrupt, of course, in Rebuke. 15-second cooldown, pretty standard. Hammer of Justice, 1-minute cooldown, 6-second stun. It's got a short range on it, 10 yards, so it's not huge, but it's not quite just melee range. And then for movement, we do have Divine Steed, 45-second cooldown, basically lets you epic mount for 3 seconds in whatever, combat indoors. It's just a big sprint. And then we do have our spammable heal in Flash of Light, which you can cast on yourself or any other person and just heals. It does cost mana, so you can only do it a few times before you go out of mana. Of course, as you can see here, it's kind of eating away at the mana, but you do regenerate it pretty quickly. But for spot kind of emergency healing, it can be kind of nice. Now let's go ahead and talk about your talents. Now in the first row, in general, Execution Sentence is going to be the best for pure single target. However, it's only slightly better than Final Verdict. And so what I would recommend is simulating your character by using something like Simulation Craft. Just see which one is going to perform better for you. So kind of as you gear, as you get different pieces, trinkets, etc., see how you sim with it, if it does better or not. The other thing too is if you can't keep a good uptime on it, if you can't play it right, or if the fight prevents you from using it almost on cooldown and so on, you might actually do better with Final Verdict just because you might be misplaying it, or something like that, so it's just a lot easier to do Final Verdict as well, if you so choose. And if there's any sort of adds, then Execution Sentence starts to lose out. Now, Consecration, really good for AoE. It just drops this AoE effect on the ground, and as you can see, it kind of ticks for the time, hitting enemies and so on. And it's really good for big AoE pools, bosses. Mythic Plus can be really good if you want to focus on AoE, but it does make you lose out on single target. So just be aware of that, and if things move a lot, like out of your Consecration, it loses value, of course. But if there's a lot of AoE, it's going to be really, really nice. And if there's any mixture, so if it's kind of like some AoE, some single target, generally Final Verdict is going to be a good choice. So this is a good default choice if you're not sure if you can use the other two correctly, or if you're not sure the fight is great for it. And also I'll make mention, if you happen to have the back piece legendary, the Whisper here, then Final Verdict is just better than the other two in all situations, pretty much. Alright, now level 30, it depends on how many targets you have. So single target, Fires the Justice, generally reduces the cooldown on your Crusader Strike, gives you a chance to proc a buff that makes your Holy Power spenders cost less, so instead of 3 Holy Power for Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm, it's just 2. And then Zeal, generally for kind of AoE cleave, or if there's kind of a mixture of single target and AoE, can be really good. So like Mythic Plus comes to mind if you want to be good at both AoE and single target, or just any fight in which you can switch between the two. And what this does is it replaces Crusader Strike with a stronger spell. It gives you a buff every time you use it, stacks up to 3 times, and for every stack, when you Zeal, it will jump to another target and kind of do a little bit of damage to those targets. So it's kind of nice for some cleave, and it does do more than Crusader Strike, just it's going to be on a slightly longer cooldown than with Fires of Justice. Now for big AoE, like 4+ at least targets, Greater Judgment can be really good. And what it does is makes your Judgment hit basically 4 targets instead of 2 when it bounces off. And it always crits, so Judgment will always crit if the targets are above half health. And this can be good, but you really want to make sure that there are adds, at least, those 4 targets up almost the whole fight. So you want to be getting constant value out of this in order to make this worth it. And things like Scorpion and Nighthold come to mind if you are forcibly spawning all the adds all the time just to kind of pad meters, stuff like that. So generally you won't see it quite as much, but it can be really good in those situations. Otherwise, Zeal for kind of more AoE-ish, and Fires of Justice for single target. Now, I will mention that if you're generating so much Holy Power that you kind of leave Crusader Strike on cooldown a lot because you just don't need to, or you don't have, you're already at 5 all the time or something, then you can consider actually using Zeal instead of Fires for single target, because at that point you're wasting the cooldown. You're basically wasting Crusader Strike, and you might as well get more damage off of Zeal. So in those situations, you can take Zeal instead, and something like either having like really high haste comes to mind, or maybe the four-piece tier set in which you generate more holy power. So if you feel that way, you can take Zeal for single target. But if you have, like the Legendary Cloak again, kind of like in the Fear 15, Fires will generally be better, but it still applies if you feel like you're leaving Crusader Strike at 2 stacks the whole time because you never really need to use it, then you might consider Zeal. But again, you can also simulate that to see which one's going to be better for your character, so definitely do that as well. It's something I can recommend. Now level 45, pretty simple, it's all CC, so if you need more stuns, Fist of Justice will reduce the remaining cooldown on your stun, depending on how much holy power you spend. Repentance is just a 15-second cooldown, kind of incapacitate CC, so you can use it to take a mob like in a Mythic Plus out of the fight for a while. It does do some damage over time, but it does break if other people do damage to it. Blinding Light is kind of a general go-to, I suppose, if there's any AoE in a fight. It's a 1.5 minute cooldown, and just explodes in light around you, does damage, actually, a decent amount of damage to the stuff, which is why it's pretty okay for like doing just damage in AoE, even on raid fights. But also, you can use it to kind of temporarily interrupt a spell cast in, say, like a Mythic Plus dungeon, but it will break if they take any non-holy damage, so just keep that in mind. Now for level 60, it's pretty clear and easy choice. Blade of Wrath for single target. This just makes it so your auto attacks have a chance to reset the cooldown of your Blade of Justice. So you just get resets on this, generate more holy power, and that's really good. Now if there's any sort of more than one target going on, so if there's just 2 targets or there's some AoE that happens in a fight, then I really recommend Divine Hammer. It does a crap load of damage for AoE. Summons hammers around you, as you can see, replaces your Blade of Justice, a slightly longer cooldown, and it keeps doing damage, and it will generate the 2 holy power as soon as it hits something. So as soon as it makes contact with something, as you see, it generates 2 holy power. And it just does a lot of AoE damage, so it's really strong. Now, Virtue's Blade I don't really recommend pretty much ever right now, so it's basically between these two. Level 75, basically you can pick whatever kind of fits your preference or situation. I don't really recommend Justicar's Vengeance though. It's a 5 holy power spell, does a decent amount of damage, and it does do double damage against stun targets, and does heal you for the damage you do. The only problem with it is that it's generally not usable in terms of, it just doesn't do as much damage as Templar's Verdict per holy power spent. So even though, it's really close, it actually looks like it does a little bit more, as you can see, than Templar's Verdict, but it costs 5 holy power instead of 3, so it's just not efficient in general. If you just want to focus on self-heals with some damage, you could take it, but I don't really recommend it that much. If there's physical damage in like a raid fight or a Mythic Plus or something, Eye for an Eye can be really good. 1 minute cooldown reduces physical damage you take by 35%, and if something attacks you, melees you, then you counterattack and do a little damage to it. 1 minute cooldown, very simple. If there's no physical damage though, it's not that useful, so keep that in mind. And then Word of Glory, it's a heal spell, 3 holy power, 1 minute charge, or 1 minute cooldown, and 2 charges, and this basically heals you and 5 nearby people, so within 15 yards of you for a good amount. This can be really good in Mythic Plus, or if you just need to kind of spot heal in a raid, but it does come at the cost of DPS because you're using holy power on basically healing instead of DPS. So kind of up to you what you like, what you find useful in your situation. And then at level 90, again, kind of up to you. The only one I don't really recommend is Judgment of Light. Really not that great. And there are, prop Pallies and holy Pallies have this option too, and they're better off doing this than you. Divine Intervention reduces the cooldown of your Divine Shield. So instead of 5 minutes, it's 4 minutes. And it also makes it so that if you die, it instead procs your Divine Shield if it's not on cooldown already, and if you don't have Forbearance or something. And then it puts you up to 20% of your health. So kind of cool, really nice survivability cooldown. But if you need more mobility, you can take Cavalier, and it just gives your Divine Steed 2 charges instead of 1. Now level 100, you pretty much just take Crusade. There's pretty much no reason to take the other 2 in PvE content, Mythic Plus, or raids, or otherwise. So I just don't really recommend the other 2. Now Crusade replaces your Avenging Wrath, and instead of doing all this damage up front, it gives you 3% damage and haste. But every time you spend holy power, for each point, you stack another 3% damage and haste. So it goes up to 15 stacks. So when you're max stacks, you're getting an extra 45% damage and haste, making you do a crap load of damage in your burst. It's really good. pretty much take this, learn how to use it. The other two just not really worth looking at in PvE. Now let's look at your artifact weapon and pathing choices here. Now I generally recommend that you just go around the long way. So you start here, and then you'll grab extra damage from Crusader Strike, extra damage from your either Blade of Justice or Divine Hammer, crit strike on Crusader Strike, longer duration on Avenging Wrath, Judgment, damage up, reduction in Forbearance, kind of useless, but it's all the way. Might of the Templar, so Templar's Verdict, damage buff, and then your first golden trait up here. Now this is the one that makes it so your Wake of Ashes actually generates 5 holy power and does some damage over time, so it makes it really, really useful and part of your rotation. After that, I recommend going and grabbing your second golden trait, Echo of the High Lord, because it buffs both your Templar's Verdict and your Divine Storm, and that's why you'll see sometimes 2 Divine Storms or 2 Templar's Verdicts happening. It just basically makes them 10% stronger. And then go down here, grab, Embrace the Light, unfortunately you have to get to your third golden trait. This buffs your Divine Storm by 20% and shoots it forward. This is what makes your your Divine Storm shoot forward. After that, probably grab your Divine Storm damage, and at this point it's entirely up to you what you want to get. It doesn't really matter that much. I'd probably maybe grab the CC break because you get the full value in 1 point, and then Blessing of Protection, cooldown reduction, can be pretty useful to save people, and then the Divine Storm healing people is pretty worthless, but kind of up to you on these last 3 what you want to take. Now as far as relics go, the best one is Wrath of the Ashbringer, so the longer Avenging Wrath or longer Crusade. If you can't get that though, there are some other good options. Anything that buffs your damage is really, really good, like Templar's Verdict, Judgment damage, Crusader Strike, crit chance, or Divine Hammer damage, stuff like that. Anything that increases your damage is pretty good, although you prefer generally single target over Divine Storm. And then even the Shield of Vengeance cooldown reduction can be pretty nice over here. Deflection, because you can use that more often, but generally anything that increases DPS, very good. But on top is the Crusade or Avenging Wrath duration extension. Now let's talk about your stats a little. So in general, I recommend you simulate your character and see what is best for you based on your gear, your talents, etc. But if you just want a generic rule of thumb, haste, generally the best, and then crit and versatility are together as your second and third, kind of about the same value, and then mastery is at the bottom. And mastery increases the damage that your judgment debuff gives you on targets, and so it's not always up, and it does increase the judgment damage as well, but it's not always up, and so just not quite as good as the other stats. But the other 3 stats, haste, crit, and verse, are all quite close. So I wouldn't really give up item. Generally follow the item levels, unless there's a lot of mastery on something and you lose like a lot of haste. But best way to know for sure is to simulate your character. But that's kind of your generic stat priority if you just want to go with that. Haste and then crit verse are about the same, and then mastery at the bottom. It's pretty simple, and the concept is you want to build up holy power up to 5, pull up your holy power up to 5, and then judgment when you're ready to spend it, and then spend as much holy power as possible during that judgment kind of window. So use your 2 abilities, generate holy power up to 5 if possible, then judgment, and then Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm, depending on the situation, as much as possible. Once judgment is gone, then you build up holy power again, and then judgment when it's ready, spend holy power, and you kind of do that in rotation. Now as far as which spell you want to use, generally you're going to want to use your Blade of Justice as much as possible if you're doing single target, especially because of the reset that can happen. And then Crusader Strike when you don't have that available. Or if you already have 4 holy power, for example, and you only need 1, then you don't want to waste that extra holy power. Same thing with Divine Hammer. You still want to use that on AoE because it does a lot of damage and it generates 2 holy power, so you want that up and active as much as possible. Now as far as using your cooldowns, Wake of Ashes should be used pretty much on cooldown if you can help it. Remember, it does generate 5 holy power for you once you get your Ashes to Ashes golden trait, so you don't want to waste holy power if possible when you use it. So try to have no holy power when you use Wake of Ashes, but if you end up having to waste 1 just to keep it on a close timer with your other cooldown, your Crusade or Avenging Wrath, then it's worth it to do that. So don't necessarily delay it super long, more than like a global or 2 if you can help it, but if, try not to waste holy power with it if you can. Now as far as using Crusade, you basically want to have a bunch of holy power ready to go when you go into Crusade, and you want to spend it as fast as possible. You want to get to 15 stacks as soon as you can, because that means you're doing your maximum damage for longer. So you want to pop Crusade when you have lots of holy power, and then, Judgment if you need to or whatever, and just kind of spend as much holy power as possible, and you'll get faster and faster, it gets easier, and you'll have more leeway on things like your Judgment window, because your Judgment is going to last a lot longer than the cooldown will be with all that haste, stuff like that. So it's very fast-paced cooldown, but it's also kind of forgiving in its own way. Now, as far as using stuff like trinkets or using like consumables, like your pots with it, other than the pre-pot, you can actually wait depending on how long yours lasts. So mine, because I have 3 relics, lasts 35 seconds. So I have some time that I can build up stuff before I use like a trinket or before I use, a potion or something in a second, crusade. So you consider that as well. But in general, just pop stuff with it, things like trinkets and pots, and you'll do pretty well. Now, I will quick mention of how to use Execution Sentence and Consecration. Basically, Execution Sentence and Consecration are to be used on cooldown when available, and as a note, Execution Sentence does not do its damage immediately. It puts a debuff on the target, and once that expires, it does damage, and that is when you want to have Judgment active, is when it actually expires and does damage. You do not necessarily need to have it up when you cast, so you can actually cast Execution Sentence before you put a Judgment, build up some holy power, and then Judgment just to catch, the explosion before it does go off. And Consecration, just when there's AoE, use it on cooldown as much as possible. Make sure things are standing in it the whole time, or as long as possible if you can. But I will be demonstrating with Final Verdict because it's generally what more people use, either because they sim better with it, or they have the legendary cape, or they just don't feel confident in using Execution Sentence for that small gain. Now, both single target and AoE are pretty similar, so I'll just show you the single target version and just kind of substitute what you need for AoE. The only difference is, of course, talents you might use, like Divine Hammer or Consecration. So just use that on cooldown, and Divine Hammer you use the same way as Blade of Wrath. And then you substitute Divine Storm for Templar's Verdict. Now, Templar's Verdict is best for single target, but Divine Storm generally best for 3 or more targets. But if you have all of the talents or traits that buff Divine Storm in your artifact weapon, then it's actually better than Templar's Verdict at as low as 2 targets. So anything more than 1 target, Divine Storm, when it's fully done in the weapon, is better. But that's pretty much the only difference between AoE and single target, and just making sure you have Judgment up on whatever targets you're trying to hit. So, as far as the opener goes, it's just pre-pot, of course, Blade of Justice, Crusader Strike, Judgment, Crusade, Templar's Verdict, and then Wake of Ashes, because you'll have 0 holy power at that point, and then off to the races, basically. Spend as much holy power as you can, do your Crusade thing. If you happen to have the Legendary Ring, I do want to mention very briefly, just cut out the Crusader Strike in the beginning, and just keep an eye on your holy power generation, just expect that it might be there. So, Blade of Justice, Judgment, Crusade, Templar's Verdict, and then Wake of Ashes, and the same thing. And you immediately get a holy power from that ring when you use it, so just keep that in mind every time you pop Crusade, that you should make sure you're not fully capped or you're wasting that first little charge of it. Now I'll go ahead and demonstrate for you guys. So we'll start here, we'll pre-pot, and then Blade of Justice, Crusader Strike, Judgment, Crusade, Templar's Verdict, Wake of Ashes, and then kind of go off. So Templar's Verdict, spend your holy power. You just want to spend as much as possible at this point, now that we're in Crusade. So Judgment's up, use that, use Blade of Justice as much as you can, as it comes off resets and so on. And just keep an eye on your timer. So here we want to get Judgment before we spend again, because we don't want to lose out on that extra damage. And then just keep going like so. Now I notice Wake of Ashes is coming off fairly soon, so kind of keep an eye on that. Try to plan it out so you end up with close to 0, if not 0, holy power when it comes up. So here I'll be able to squeeze in a couple here, hit that, I'll Wake of Ashes, and then, back to, now that we're out of Crusade, kind of back to your regular rotation here. So squeeze in Templar's Verdict before Judgment goes away, and I'll pull up as much holy power as I can. I don't want a Judgment until I have as much as I can, so I didn't have to wait too long for that. So then I'll Judgment, spend holy power, and then spend as much holy power as I can in the Judgment window. And then once it's gone, just pull up holy power, and I notice I have Blade of Justice, so I can actually get to 5 this time again. Now here I have Wake of Ashes, so I'll try to get it emptied as soon as possible my holy power. I'm not going to wait any more than this though, so because it's just taking too long because I got that lucky proc or unlucky proc perhaps. So I wasted one holy power there, not ideal, but you don't want to keep it waiting too long. You don't want to keep it aligned or close to aligned with your Crusade if possible. Now, out of Judgment again, so I'm just going to go ahead and wait, build up holy power, and here I get a lucky proc, so I'll go up to 5, and then Judgment, spend it, use Blade. I got some lucky procs here, so I'll keep using my Blade of Justice as much as I can. And then here, I see Wake of Ashes, so I'll go ahead and stop at 3, spend Judgment, spend, Wake of Ashes, spend, and just kind of like keep track of your cooldowns, when stuff is coming up, when Judgment's ready, when your cooldowns are ready. And also here, you notice Crusade is getting pretty close, so you might want to start thinking about pulling up some holy power. So 7 seconds, 6 seconds, we'll start pulling up here. And then, we're about ready to go, so Judgment, Crusade, and start spending as much as possible. And again, still keeping an eye on the Wake of Ashes timer so that you're ready to go when it is. So here on Judgment, I have a proc, so I can cast it at 2, Wake of Ashes, and just keep doing the same thing. So that's pretty much it. If you want to do AoE, it's the exact same thing here. I'll spend on Divine Storm here instead. I'll start spending it there. Same thing, and Divine Hammer would be there, so you wouldn't get resets, and it'd be a little different on the timers. But you may have a little bit of downtime with a bigger AoE spec, but it's pretty much the same concept. So building up holy power, spending it after you've used Judgment, and then same kind of thing. So that's pretty much the rotation, just in general. Again, if you're using one of these two talents, it'd be a little bit different, but pretty similar. Just keep an eye on when you need things to happen, like when Execution Sentence comes off, or actually explodes and does damage, and stuff like that. For macros and add-ons, I do use a few macros. The first is a cooldown with my Trinket. Now, technically, I could optimize it better. I have a 2-minute cooldown Trinket, which is why I put them together, because they're the exact same cooldown. But technically, the Trinket lasts 30 seconds, and Crusade lasts 35, so I could actually separate these, use the Trinket 5 seconds into Crusade when I have a few stacks already built. That would actually do a little bit more damage, but you might forget to use the Horn, for example, or your whatever Trinket you happen to have. So if you want to be safer, you can do this, but technically, to maximize it, if you have a longer Avenging Wrath from your artifact weapon and relics, then you can consider actually not putting them together, but this is something I do have currently. Now, I also have a Holy Power movement macro, so this is why my Holy Power is up here rather than below my frame. And that I will have linked in the description below. But basically, it's a script, and you just click on it, and it shoves it over here. Now, the thing is, because it's a script, every time you relog, reload, switch tunes, come back, exit game, come back in, you'll have to use it again. So, it can get kind of annoying, but it is there if you want it. And again, I will have that linked in the description. So, if you want to check that out. As far as the add-ons go, my main one I use is Weak Ores, as you probably saw during the demonstration and throughout the video. You can do a lot of stuff with it. I just use it very basically for cooldown tracking, so you can see the cooldown of my abilities. I have duration timers, so things like Execution Sentence, so I know when it's about to blow up, Judgment debuff, so I know when that's active or not, and how long. Stuff like that. So you can do a lot of cool stuff with this. It's very, very powerful add-on, especially if you can write code, but I just use it for simple stuff like that. My cast bar is Quartz. As you can see, it just makes it look cool. And it gives you a little latency timer, which can be nice. Action bar add-ons is Bartender 4, so you can move them around, you can play with the settings, enable the bars, disable the bars, you get all sorts of different things, extra action button, etc. So many things with Bartender. And that's pretty much what I use, or what you've seen in this video as far as my UI goes. The rest of it is kind of default, just moving my frames and such. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you liked the video, feel free to hit it with a like. If you want to see when I put new content out, or just more guides like this for different classes and so on, feel free to subscribe to the channel. If you have questions, comments, things you want to say, feel free to put those in the comments section. And you can also swing by when I'm streaming on my Twitch channel and just ask questions or just hang out there if you like. Well, thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.